Hello again. In part 1 of this series, I gave you all the terminology you need to know to name any technique that a colour belt should know. And in this video, I'll show you how to put the terminology together in the correct order to name any technique in full. Because every technique should have a unique name that describes it in full without any ambiguity. So let's start with hand techniques first. The technique description is made up of the type of technique and the technique specification. For hand techniques, the type of technique can be a punch, strike, thrust or block. But there are many ways to do a punch or a strike, etc. So we need to identify the technique specification to describe how the technique is performed. The technique specification can be a description of its direction, for example, upward, downward, inward or outward. An example is upward block, olyo maki, or inward strike, hanuro terigi. Or it can be the position of the tool in relation to the body, for example, front, back, side, side front, and side back. For example, front punch, up chirigi, side front block, yobap maki, or side strike, yop terigi. When the direction or the tool position is not applicable or not useful to describe the technique, then a special name can be given to describe the technique. For example, angle punch, gyokcha chirigi, or circular block, tolimyo maki. There are also cases where there is no technique specification given, but by specifying the tool used helps to describe how the technique should be performed. For example, for a thrust, by specifying the tool as a side elbow means that it's a side elbow thrust, yok palkup tulgi, which can only be performed in one way. Another example is for a strike. Using the upper elbow gives you an upper elbow strike, wi palkup terigi. Notice that in these cases, side elbow and upper elbow are the names of tools and not the technique specification, although it provides information just like a technique specification. Most techniques can be done at different heights, so we need to specify the height before the name of the technique. For example, a side block can be done as a high, middle or low block. So by specifying the height before the name of the technique, we get high side block, nopunde yok maki, or middle side block, kaunde yok maki, or low side block, najunde yok maki. But some techniques don't require the height description. For example, rising block, chukya maki. There are no high, middle and low versions of this block. Many techniques can be done with more than one tool. For example, a side strike can be done with a back fist, side fist or a knife hand. So we need to specify the tool by placing it before the height and the name of the technique. For example, back fist high side strike, tongjumo no punde yok terigi, or knife hand middle side strike, songkal kaunde yok terigi. Sometimes you don't need to specify the name of the tool because the technique is used in its most common tool. For example, with a punch like middle front punch, kaunde up chirigi, you would normally use the forefist, up chumok. As a colour belt, you're more likely to just learn punches using the forefist, but as a black belt, you would know that there are other types of fists that can be used. For example, a knuckle fist or an open fist or a long fist. But if no tool is specified for a punch, then you'll assume it's a forefist. Some techniques don't have common tools. For example, the side strike that I mentioned earlier can be done equally as well with the back fist or the knife hand. So it's just as common to have a back fist side strike as a knife hand side strike. Most techniques can be done with a variety of stances, so you can specify the stance at the beginning when naming a technique. For example, sitting stance middle front punch, anunso kaunde up chirigi, or L stance knife hand middle guarding block, nyunchaso songkal kaunde debi maki. X stance back fist high side strike, kyochaso tongchumok no punde yok terigi. Notice in Korean the word sogi gets shortened to so when used in naming a technique. So with the four variables stance, tool, height and technique, we can have many permutations. Just with the list I provided you in part 1, there are 10 different stances, obviously 3 different heights. I gave you about 20 different tools and about 35 different techniques. This makes 21,000 different possibilities, but not all permutations are possible. For example, if we choose the technique to be a thrust, tulgi, we already reduce the number of tools that can be used. If we choose the tool to be a side elbow, yop palkup, then the three heights are no longer applicable. And the viable options for stances is reduced to L stance, nyunja sogi, rear foot stance, twitpal sogi, or fixed stance, kochung sogi. So most permutations are not viable options. But these four variables are not enough to describe the technique completely, because we've not specified whether we're using a left or right stance or a left or right tool. For example, with walking stance, four fist, middle front punch, kununso apchumok kaunde apchirugi, there are four ways that can be done, with a left or right walking stance, or a left or right four fist. So we need to specify this in our description. If the stance is symmetrical, as with close stance, moa sogi, sitting stance, anand sogi, or parallel stance, narani sogi, then it makes things much easier because there's no left or right version. So we only need to determine whether the tool is a left or right tool. With asymmetric stances, we do need to specify whether it's a left or right stance. And instead of specifying whether the tool is using the left or right side, we use the term obverse, paro, or reverse, bandai, for the technique. And you place the word obverse or reverse just after the height and before the name of the technique. An obverse technique is when the tool is on the same side as the leading leg, and a reverse is done on the opposite side of the leading leg. But take note that when the weight distribution is predominantly on the rear leg, such as with L stance, nyuncha sogi, rear foot stance, twitpal sogi, and vertical stance, sujik sogi, then the rear leg will be the leading leg. Watch my video on obverse-reverse techniques for a more detailed description. Some tools are symmetric, such as twin fist, sang chumok, or twin side elbow, sang yop palka. So there's no need to specify whether the tool is using the left or right side with symmetric stances, or whether the technique is an obverse or reverse technique with asymmetric stances. Now let's look at the way we name kicking techniques. With kicks, there are no stances, so all we need to specify is whether we're kicking with the left or right side. Then we name the tool, then the height of the kick, and then the technique, which is in this case a type of kick. But in the Taekwondo encyclopedia, the tool is rarely mentioned in kicking techniques, and there are two reasons for this. One is that for many kicks, there is only one tool that can be used. For example, outward vertical kick, bakuro sewa chagi, can only use foot sword, palkal, and hooking kick, golcha chagi, can only use side instep, yop paltung. The second reason is that even if the kick can use a variety of tools, the encyclopedia recommends to use the common tool, which usually is the one that does more damage to the target. The common tool for the various kicks are as follows. So if you want to name a turning kick using the left foot, you would call it a left turning kick, when tolyo chagi, which assumes that it's using the ball of the foot, up kumchi. But if you're using an alternative tool like instep, paldung, then you would call it a left instep turning kick, when paldung tolyo chagi. The encyclopedia doesn't actually give any examples of naming kicks in this way, but it just makes sense that it's done this way if you were to name the tool. It's following the same rules as the hand techniques. Many kicks can be done at all three heights. For example, side piercing kick, yapcha chirigi. So you can have high side piercing kick, nopunde yapcha chirigi, middle side piercing kick, kaunde yapcha chirigi, and low side piercing kick, najunde yapcha chirigi. And there are some kicks that can only be done with one height, so you don't need to specify the height. For example, press and kick, nulla chagi. No need to specify whether it's high, middle and low, it's only one height. Now the rules for naming a flying technique. The Korean word for flying is twimyo. Flying techniques don't have any stances, so the rule for naming flying techniques is going to be very similar to naming a kicking technique. First you put the word flying, then you specify whether the tool is using the left or right side, then you name the tool, then the height of the technique, and then the technique itself. Notice the height is included there. Although most of the time you don't need to mention the height for flying techniques, sometimes it does make a difference the way the technique is performed. For example, a flying knife hand high outward strike, twinyo wen songal nopunde bakuro terigi, and a flying knife hand middle outward strike, twinyo wen songal gaunde bakuro terigi, will be performed at the attacker's shoulder level. So here's a summary of the rules of the various types of techniques we discussed in this video. In this video I've explained how to name a technique, but I've ignored the way you move into the technique. For example, you can do a technique stepping forwards, backwards, turning left or right, or double stepping forwards or backwards, and all this can be added to the description of the technique, but it's a little bit more complicated how to do this, so maybe I'll make another more advanced video another time. Now, with all the terminology that you've learnt in part 1 and with the rules that you've learnt in this video, part 2, you're now equipped to name any technique in all of the patterns from Chon-Ji Tul to Choong Moo Tul. Although it's a good exercise to do this, it's already been done by Master M Banicevich from New Zealand. He did a second-degree thesis many years ago where he explained the rules for naming a technique, very similar to what I've explained in this video, and he's also gone ahead and named every single technique from Chon-Ji Tul to Choong Moo Tul in English and in Korean. So if you're interested in reading that thesis, I'll add the link to the thesis in the description below. Another thesis on the subject was written by Henri Savilampi, who I believe was from Finland. He did a very detailed study for his master's thesis. It's a lot more detailed than what I covered today, so if you're interested in reading that thesis, I'll put a link to it in the description below. Now in my next video, I'll be giving you some more terminology, not for Taekwondo techniques, but for terminology that every color belt should know on other things. So please join me for that. See you next time. Bye.